Good evening. There is a man in a police station in Bogotá, Colombia. He is trying to explain to the officer what happened last night, why his bank account is empty, why his apartment has been cleared of everything that mattered, why his neighbors watched him carry his own belongings into a stranger's van just before midnight, smiling, holding the door open, apparently content. He cannot explain it. Not because he is lying, because he genuinely does not know. He remembers a woman, he remembers a drink, he remembers nothing after that, not the van, not the men, not his own hands dismantling his own life. The memories were not buried, not suppressed, they were simply never recorded. The camera was running all night, the film was blank. The streets of Bogotá call this powder devil's breath. The medical world knows it as Scopolamine. But what makes it so terrifying is not only what it is doing on the streets of South America today. It is that decades before the cartels discovered it, the United States government was quietly perfecting it. From the interrogation rooms of the Cold War, to the CIA's MKUltra program, to the dating apps where it is being used right now. This is the history of the drug that erases human free will. Before we go further, if these quiet journeys into the darker corners of history give you somewhere safe to rest, hit like and subscribe before you close your eyes. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you are tonight. Dim the lights. Set your phone face down and let us begin. To understand why scopolamine attracted the attention of intelligence agencies, it helps to understand precisely what it does. Not in the vague language of street mythology, but in the specific, clinical language of neuroscience. Because the reason governments wanted this molecule is the same reason criminals still use it today. And once you understand the mechanism, you will understand why both groups found it so extraordinarily useful. The human brain contains a structure called the hippocampus. It sits deep inside the temporal lobe, curved and small, roughly the size and shape of a seahorse, which is in fact what its name means in Greek. Its function, among several, is one of the most intimate things the brain does. It takes what is happening to you right now and converts it into something you will carry forward. Experience into memory, the present into the past. It is, in the most personal sense imaginable, the part of you that makes you continuous, the part that connects who you were this morning to who you will be tomorrow. That conversion happens through chemistry. A neurotransmitter called acetylcholine carries the signal. When something occurs, when you see something, hear something, feel something, do something, the signal travels inward, and acetylcholine carries it to the hippocampus through a set of molecular gates called muscarinic receptors. There are several subtypes of these receptors, designated by pharmacologists as M1 through M4. When acetylcholine binds to them, the gate opens, the signal passes through, and the process of encoding that experience into long-term memory begins. Scopolamine is, at its most fundamental level, a key that fits those gates but does not open them. It is what pharmacologists call a muscarinic antagonist, a compound that occupies the receptor sites without activating them, blocking acetylcholine from binding, holding the gates closed. The signal arrives. The gate is locked. The experience passes through the body. The person remains upright, conscious, capable of speech and movement, and apparently normal behavior. But the encoding mechanism has been disabled. Whatever happens next will not be remembered. Not because the memory is suppressed, not because it is buried somewhere retrievable, but because it was never formed. The camera, as the man in the Bogotá police station would later struggle to explain, was running all night. The film was blank. This is what makes scopolamine categorically different from sedatives, from alcohol, from the benzodiazepines like diazepam that are also associated with drug-facilitated crime. Those substances impair the person visibly. They make the body clumsy and the mind slow. An observer watching someone heavily sedated can see that something is wrong. The person slurs. They stumble. Their responses are delayed. Their incapacity is written on the surface of them, readable by anyone who looks. Scopolamine, at certain doses, produces none of this. What it produces instead is something that researchers and victims have struggled to describe precisely because it is so fundamentally alien to ordinary experience. The person under the influence of a sufficient dose of scopolamine is not incapacitated in any obvious sense. They can hold a conversation, they can answer questions, they can perform complex tasks. Withdrawing money from an ATM, packing belongings into boxes, opening doors for strangers, signing documents. Their affect may even be pleasant. People who were victimized by scopolamine and who encountered others during the hours of their intoxication have been told afterward that they seemed perfectly fine. Calm, in fact, helpful, agreeable. What is missing is the capacity to refuse. Not the physical capacity. The person could, in theory, say no. The mechanism of refusal is intact. What is missing is the generation of the thought that refusal might be appropriate. The evaluative function, the part of the mind that weighs a request against one's own interests and finds it wanting, appears to be impaired independently of the memory impairment. Researchers have noted this as a distinct phenomenon. The drug's disruption of what is sometimes called executive function, the higher order processing, that allows a person to make decisions in their own interest rather than simply responding to whatever stimulus is in front of them. Scopolamine disrupts both functions simultaneously. Memory encoding fails. Autonomous decision-making falters. What remains is a person who can act but cannot evaluate, who can comply but cannot resist. The compliance is to observers indistinguishable from consent. It is worth pausing here for a moment because the implications of that sentence are easy to read past and difficult to fully absorb. We tend to think of the will as something robust, something that requires effort to overcome, that fights back, that leaves evidence of the struggle. We think of coercion as something that looks like coercion. Marks, resistance, the visible signs of a person being made to do something they do not want to do. What scopolamine demonstrated with quiet pharmacological efficiency was that this assumption was wrong, that the will was not robust, that it was a chemical process like any other chemical process, and that it could be interrupted like any other chemical process, cleanly and without drama, leaving the person's outward behavior entirely unchanged while removing the interior mechanism that made that behavior their own. A person emptying their bank account at gunpoint looks like a person being robbed. A person emptying their bank account under scopolamine looks like a person making a routine withdrawal. That distinction was not lost on the people whose profession was coercion. The people who understood what scopolamine could do were not only scientists. The Cold War was, among other things, a war about information. Each side needed to know what the other side knew, and the challenge was extracting that information from people who had been trained, sometimes heroically, to withstand conventional interrogation. Physical coercion had limitations. It produced confessions that were often unreliable because a person in enough pain will say anything to make the pain stop. whether or not it is true. Psychological manipulation was more promising, but required skilled practitioners and considerable time. What the agencies on both sides of the Iron Curtain wanted, what they devoted considerable resources and ingenuity to finding, was a chemical shortcut, a substance that would bypass the will entirely, that would make a trained operative as forthcoming as a person having a friendly conversation, that would leave no marks and produce no obvious signs of coercion. The phrase they used for what they were looking for was truth serum. It was and remains a somewhat misleading term. What they actually wanted was not truth exactly. What they wanted was compliance, a subject who could not refuse to answer, a subject who would respond to questions without the filter of self-protection, without the ability to calculate what was safe to say and what was not, without the capacity to construct a deliberate deception. What they wanted, in other words, was precisely what scopolamine could produce. By the time the CIA's interest in chemical interrogation methods became formally organized in the early 1950s, scopolamine was already on the list of candidates. It had been there for some time. A Texas physician named Robert House had experimented with it in 1922. We will return to him shortly, because he is the man who accidentally handed governments the concept that would haunt the next 100 years of intelligence work. And his findings had circulated in medical and law enforcement literature for 3 decades. The CIA's predecessors, the Office of Strategic Services, which operated during the Second World War, had looked at it. The military had looked at it. The Soviets, it was believed, were looking at it. The program that would eventually subsume all of this looking, that would bring it under a single classified umbrella, and fund it with government money, and conduct it with the organized ruthlessness that only a government at war, even a Cold War, can sustain, was called MKUltra. It began officially in 1953. It would run for more than a decade. And what it found about scopolamine and about the entire category of chemical agents it was investigating would be both more interesting and more disturbing than anyone involved had anticipated. The fundamental problem with scopolamine as a truth serum, and the CIA's researchers identified this problem relatively early, was the same quality that made it so effective as a tool of street crime. At the doses required to produce genuine compliance, the drug also produced something else, delirium. A person in a scopolamine-induced delirium is not a reliable source of information. They are a person experiencing hallucinations, confabulating freely, mixing memory with invention in ways they cannot distinguish, and neither can the interrogator. The subject might tell you everything they know. They might tell you everything they have ever imagined. They might tell you elaborate and internally consistent narratives that bear no relationship to reality whatsoever. The CIA's researchers found, with some frustration, that there was no reliable way to separate the truthful from the confabulated while the subject was under the drug's influence. The truth serum produced truth and fiction in the same voice, indistinguishably. House had noted this problem in his own early experiments, and then set it aside with what his colleagues considered a somewhat unreasonable optimism. The CIA's researchers were less inclined toward optimism. They were running a program with defined objectives and limited time in the context of an intelligence competition that felt existential. They needed something that worked reliably. Scopolamine, it became clear, did not work reliably as an interrogation tool in the way they had hoped. What they found, instead, was something more interesting. The drug did not reliably produce truth, but it did, at certain doses and in certain conditions, produce a state of profound suggestibility, a state in which the subject was less a source of information and more a receiver of instructions, less someone from whom things could be extracted, and more someone through whom things could be directed. A person in this state would not necessarily tell you what they knew, but they might, under the right prompting, do what you asked them to do. This was a subtly different thing from what the program had set out to find, but it was not, to the people running the program, an uninteresting thing. The implications of a chemical that could produce behavioral compliance in a trained adult human being, compliance that left no marks, that the subject would not remember, that would look to any observer like voluntary cooperation, were considerable. The program continued, the experiments expanded. Scopolamine remained on the list, even as other substances attracted more attention, even as the program moved toward LSD and barbiturates and combinations of chemicals that the researchers believed might do more cleanly what scopolamine did imperfectly. But the concept that scopolamine had demonstrated, the concept of pharmacological compliance, did not leave the program. It stayed there underneath everything else, a proof of principle that no amount of institutional frustration could entirely erase. There were, in the program's files, the ones that survived the 1973 destruction order, references to experiments conducted in what the CIA called safe houses. Apartments rented under false names in cities including New York and San Francisco. Inside them, operatives administered various substances to subjects who, in many cases, had no idea they were participating in an experiment at all. Some were recruited through deception. Some were prisoners. Some were patients in hospitals whose physicians had entered into quiet arrangements with the agency. The ethical framework governing these experiments was, to put it with considerable restraint, minimal. Scopolamine appeared in these records alongside other substances: sodium pentothal, mescaline, LSD, various barbiturates, as part of a broader effort to find what the program's internal documents called a means of rendering an individual subservient to an imposed will. The language is precise in the way that bureaucratic language about terrible things tends to be precise. Subservient, imposed will. The words describe what was being attempted without describing what it felt like to be the person it was being attempted upon. The subjects, in most cases, never knew what had been given to them. They woke from whatever state the drug had produced, with no reliable account of what had occurred. Their testimony, if sought, would have been useless, which was, in a sense, the point. The program was testing not only whether the drug worked, but whether its use could be concealed, or whether a person could be chemically controlled and then returned to their ordinary life with no evidence that anything had happened at all. In this narrow respect, the concealment, the experiments were often successful. The drug left no reliable forensic trace. The subjects remembered little or nothing. The operation could be denied. What the program had not yet solved was the reliability problem. The question of whether the compliance produced was consistent enough and the information or behavior produced accurate enough to be operationally useful. That problem, as it turned out, they never fully solved. Decades later, when the cartels of Colombia's cities began systematically using burundanga on the streets of Bogotá and Medellin, they were not building on the CIA's research. They arrived at the same destination by a completely different road. But they arrived at the same destination nonetheless. The man in the police station, bank account empty, apartment cleared, neighbors describing his cheerful cooperation with the people who robbed him, was experiencing exactly what the CIA had been trying to produce in their classified rooms. Not torture, not sedation, not the chaos of a mind rendered useless by chemicals, but the specific targeted removal of the capacity to resist, while everything else, consciousness, speech, motor function, apparent normality, remained intact. The difference was that the CIA never quite managed it cleanly enough to be satisfied. The cartels were not looking for clean. And that difference between the government's frustrated pursuit of a reliable method and the criminal underworld's pragmatic acceptance of an imperfect one is perhaps the most unsettling thing about this entire history. The intelligence agencies of the most powerful nation on earth spent years and considerable classified funding trying to achieve pharmaceutical control of the human will, and ultimately concluded that the tools available were too imprecise, too unpredictable, too unreliable for their purposes. The streets of Bogotá concluded differently. They concluded that imprecise was sufficient, that unpredictable was acceptable, that a drug which worked 8 times out of 10, which left the victim conscious and cooperative and remembering nothing, which cost almost nothing to produce, and could be administered in a crowded bar without anyone noticing, that drug was useful enough. And so while the CIA's program wound down and its records were eventually destroyed, the molecule remained, patient, colourless, available, waiting for whoever came next. In 1922, in the city of Dallas, Texas, a physician named Robert Ernest House became convinced he had discovered something that would change the world. House was an obstetrician, a man whose professional life was organized around the particular challenges of childbirth, around the twilight state that certain anesthetic combinations produced in women during labor. The preparation he used in his practice was a blend called Scopolamine morphine chloroform, a combination that had become standard in obstetric wards across the United States and Europe in the early decades of the 20th century. Physicians of the era called the state. It produced twilight sleep. The patient remained conscious enough to cooperate with instructions. She remained sedated enough to be largely unaware of pain. And, crucially, she was largely unable to form clear and lasting memories of what had occurred. Women who delivered children under twilight sleep often had little recollection of the birth itself. The event had happened. The body had moved through it. The mind, in any meaningful sense, had not been present for it. The phenomenon of twilight sleep had itself been controversial in the medical community since its popularization in the early 1900s. European physicians, particularly at the University of Freiburg in Germany, had developed and championed the technique, and a small movement of American women, progressive, educated, advocates for their own medical rights, had campaigned vigorously for its adoption in American hospitals. They had visited German clinics, documented their observations, and lobbied medical institutions back home to take the technique seriously. The campaign was, in historical terms, successful. Twilight sleep became widely available in American obstetric practice by the 1910s. What the advocates had not fully addressed, and what would eventually complicate the technique's legacy, was the question of what the patients under its influence were actually experiencing. The drug did not eliminate pain, as some promotional material had suggested. It eliminated the memory of pain. Whether these were the same thing whether an experience that left no trace was an experience at all in any morally meaningful sense, was a question that the movement's more reflective members found uncomfortable to examine. House watched this phenomenon across years of practice, and he had a thought. If scopolamine could do this in the delivery room, if it could produce a state in which a person responded to instructions and questions while being unable to clearly remember the encounter afterward, then perhaps it could be used in a rather different context. Perhaps the subject questioned under its influence would answer without the usual filters of self-interest and social calculation, without the capacity to weigh consequences, to construct a strategic version of events, to perform innocence. Perhaps, in that altered state, a person might simply say what was true. In early 1922, he arranged to test the hypothesis. Through his contacts in the Dallas medical and legal communities, he secured access to 2 prisoners held in the Dallas County Jail. 2 men whose guilt, in the estimation of the authorities who held them, was essentially not in doubt. House administered scopolamine to both and conducted careful interviews. Under the drug, both men denied the charges against them, coherently, consistently, without apparent distress or confusion. Both men, when their cases subsequently came to trial before a jury that had not witnessed the scopolamine interviews, were found not guilty. House concluded with a conviction that would only intensify over the years that followed, that the drug had reached past the ordinary mechanisms of human self-protection and produced something closer to pure disclosure. That a person under its influence could not, as he later wrote, create a lie. That the power to think or reason in the service of deception was, under scopolamine, simply not available. He wrote up his findings. He lectured widely. He became, in the years between 1921 and 1929, one of the more visible and controversial figures in American forensic medicine. A man who had produced 11 papers arguing for a chemical that could compel human beings to tell the truth, who had coined or inspired the phrase that would follow this molecule for the rest of its history, and who had acquired, in the process, the somewhat double-edged distinction of being called the father of truth serum. Truth serum. The phrase is believed to have appeared first in a 1922 report in the Los Angeles Record, describing House's Dallas experiments. House initially resisted the term. He found it imprecise and sensationalist, both of which it was. But as the years passed and the phrase proved more durable than any of his more careful formulations, he eventually adopted it himself, and by the late 1920s was using it as readily as any of the journalists who had invented it. The idea entered the public imagination quickly and with considerable force. It arrived at a moment when courts were wrestling with the reliability of confessions extracted by physical means, when the question of determining truth from testimony was genuinely unsettled, when the possibility that science might provide a clean and objective solution to the ancient problem of human deception held obvious appeal. Newspapers ran accounts of House's experiments. Law enforcement officials expressed cautious interest. Several police departments began looking into whether scopolamine could be incorporated into interrogation practice. The courts, consistently and across jurisdictions, declined to admit testimony produced under chemical influence, but legal inadmissibility did not extinguish institutional appetite. One police writer of the period documented that the mere threat of scopolamine interrogation had been sufficient in several recorded instances to prompt voluntary confessions from suspects who preferred to admit guilt rather than submit to the drug. Whether this reflected genuine fear of the substance or the psychologically coercive power of claiming to possess a truth serum is impossible now to determine. Perhaps both. There were genuine believers, physicians and criminologists, who thought the concept sound and the drug, at the right dose and in the right subject, genuinely promising. There were also skeptics who had attempted to replicate House's results and found them frustratingly inconsistent. Scopolamine did not behave the same way in every person. Some subjects became talkative and apparently candid. Some became deeply confused, manufacturing incoherent narratives with every appearance of sincerity. Some became hostile. Some went to sleep. House acknowledged these variations, but interpreted them as problems of technique rather than of fundamental mechanism, a reading that owed considerably more to conviction than to evidence. He died in 1930, before he could see where the idea he had launched would eventually travel. It moved as ideas with institutional utility tend to move, from medicine into intelligence. The Second World War created conditions in which the question of extracting information from unwilling subjects acquired an urgency that peacetime ethical constraints would not have permitted. The Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, the forerunner to the CIA, began systematic experiments with chemical interrogation aids. Scopolamine was on the list, alongside mescaline, barbiturates, and concentrated cannabis extract. George White, a federal narcotics agent recruited for his combination of relevant expertise and operational flexibility, conducted experiments on subjects who had no idea they were subjects. People given substances without their knowledge or consent observed for their responses, and then released back into their lives. White would eventually run a CIA-funded operation in San Francisco called Operation Midnight Climax, a safe house program in which prostitutes were paid to bring men back to rented apartments, where the men were secretly drugged with various substances, including scopolamine and LSD, while White observed from behind a two-way mirror, keeping careful notes on what he saw. The operation ran for years. Its subjects never knew they had participated. White himself, in a letter written after his retirement, expressed something close to nostalgia for the work. He described it as the only job where a man could combine a good deal of drinking, a certain amount of professional responsibility, and an unlimited budget without anyone asking questions about his methods. The letter was not written as a confession. It was written as a fond recollection. The OSS experiments produced results that were, in the most generous assessment, inconclusive. No substance produced the clean, reliable, controllable disclosure the researchers needed. The war ended. The question passed, unresolved, into the institutional inheritance of the organization that followed. The CIA came into formal existence in 1947. By 1950, the unfinished business of chemical mind control had acquired new urgency. American prisoners of war returning from Korea appeared altered in ways that disturbed their debriefers. Men who had signed confessions of war crimes, who had made broadcasts denouncing the United States from captivity, who seemed to have undergone genuine changes of conviction rather than merely performing under duress. The word brainwashing entered American public discourse and produced a specific institutional dread. If the communists had achieved a reliable method of restructuring the human mind, the CIA needed either to replicate that capability or to develop a defense against it. The fear was specific, and it had a specific origin. A psychologist named Edward Hunter had coined the term brainwashing in a 1950 newspaper article, translating it from the Chinese "sinao," literally to wash the brain. Hunter was, as later investigation established, not entirely a disinterested analyst. He had connections to American intelligence, and his writings served, among other purposes, the goal of discrediting the confessions Chinese authorities were producing from American prisoners. But the fear he named was real, regardless of the motivations behind the naming. 21 American soldiers at the end of the Korean War refused repatriation and elected to remain in China. The number was small in absolute terms. In symbolic terms, for an America invested in the idea of its own ideological superiority, it was profound and disturbing. The possibility that the human mind could be systematically restructured, that loyalty, conviction, and identity could be dissolved and rebuilt through methods that the United States did not yet understand and therefore could not counter, drove the CYA's investment in MKUltra with an urgency that its director described, without exaggeration, as existential. The CIA's response was authorized formally in April 1953 by Director Allen Dulles. The program was designated MKUltra. Its operational director was Sidney Gottlieb, a biochemist from New York with a clubfoot and a stammer, who kept goats on a Virginia farm, made his own wine, practiced folk dancing, and held a deep personal religious faith that coexisted, apparently without discomfort, with his professional willingness to authorize experiments that caused serious harm to people who had not consented. His biographer described him as a man who seems never to have doubted that what he was doing was necessary. That certainty was, perhaps, the most frightening thing about him. MKUltra ultimately comprised more than 150 sub-projects conducted at universities, hospitals, prisons, and safe houses across the United States and Canada. It involved LSD administered to unwitting subjects, electroshock at doses far beyond the therapeutic, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and various combinations of stimulants and depressants. And it involved returning with consistent regularity scopolamine, the molecule that House had introduced to the intelligence community's vocabulary 30 years earlier. In November 1953, 7 months after MKUltra began, the program produced a death. Frank Olson was an army biochemist working on biological weapons research, who attended a gathering of MKUltra-associated scientists in rural Maryland. His drink was altered without his knowledge. In the days that followed, he became profoundly distressed. On the 28th of November, he fell from the window of his room on the 10th floor of the Statler Hotel in Manhattan and died on the pavement below. His family was told it was a suicide. They were told nothing about the LSD or the program. They lived with that account for more than 20 years. A forensic re-examination in 1994 found evidence of blunt force trauma to his skull, inconsistent with the fall, as the sole cause. The medical examiner used a word no official investigation has since adopted: homicide. The case has never been reclassified. In 1973, facing congressional scrutiny, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of MKUltra's files. Most of the record was gone within days. What survived formed the basis of Senate hearings in 1977, which established the program's scope, its methods, and its fundamental disregard for the legal protections to which its subjects were entitled. The 1977 hearings, formally convened as a joint session of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and the Subcommittee on Health and Scientific Research, produced testimony that was, in the precise sense, revelatory. Not because it revealed everything, but because it revealed enough to establish the scope of what the destruction of records had concealed. Former CIA Director Stansfield Turner testified that the agency had conducted experiments on human subjects in a manner inconsistent with the ethical principles that govern such research. Survivors of MKUltra sub-projects testified about what had been done to them, in some cases decades earlier, in some cases without their having any prior knowledge that they had been experimental subjects at all. A Canadian psychiatrist named Ewan Cameron, who had run a CIA-funded program at McGill University involving the combination of LSD, electroshock, and what he called psychic driving, the continuous loop playing of recorded messages to sleeping patients, became, in the hearings coverage, one of the program's more fully documented faces. His patients had not consented to the treatment. Several had suffered permanent psychological damage. Cameron himself had died in 1967 before any of this became public. Sidney Gottlieb testified. He expressed something resembling regret. He died in 1999, having spent his final years volunteering at a hospice in Virginia. Those who knew him there described a man of genuine warmth. The contradiction between that man and the director of MKUltra was one he appears never to have fully resolved. The program was over. The question it had pursued remained unanswered. The threshold between useful suggestibility and uncontrollable delirium had never been reliably crossed. Robert House's dream, launched in a Dallas jail in 1922 and pursued by the most powerful intelligence apparatus in the world for 3 decades, had not been realized. The Cold War's most classified pharmaceutical program ended not with the discovery, but with a limit that the people in the streets of Bogotá, who had never read a single MKUltra document, were simply going to choose not to observe. The classified rooms went quiet. And to the south, in the bars and back streets of cities the program had never studied, someone else had been arriving at a different conclusion, not through classified research or government funding, but through the brutal logic of the street. Which is this: you do not need a drug to work perfectly. You only need it to work well enough. And well enough, as it turned out, was not difficult to achieve at all. Bogotá in the 1980s was a city in the process of being unmade. The cartels had not built their power in secret. They had built it openly, systematically, in a manner that combined extraordinary violence with a kind of grotesque civic presence. Pablo Escobar, funding housing projects in the barrios, while ordering the assassination of judges, politicians, journalists, anyone who moved against the Medellin cartel's interests with sufficient seriousness to require a permanent response. The state was not absent from Colombian life in this period. It was simply outgunned, outspent, and, in enough critical instances, outbribed. The courts functioned. The police existed. Neither institution had the sustained capacity to contain what the drug trade had become. It was in this environment, of institutional erosion, of extreme economic inequality, of a criminal economy that had grown large enough to generate its own internal logic and its own internal culture, that Burundanga found its modern form. The drug itself was not new. The borrachero tree had been growing in the Andean cloud forests for longer than anyone could measure, and the communities of pre-colonial Colombia had known its properties for generations, using it in ways that ranged from ceremony to, as the darker historical accounts suggest, coercion. The Spanish had documented it, botanists had studied it, the alkaloids it contained had been isolated, named, and entered into the pharmacological literature. Scopolamine was not a discovery of the Colombian criminal underworld. It was an inheritance. What the criminal underworld contributed was refinement and scale. The people most commonly associated with Burundanga's criminal use were not the cartel operatives who managed cocaine shipments across borders. Those were different criminals with different methods and different economies. The Burundanga users were, as the Bogotá police chief's account made clear, a significantly humbler population. Many were women who had migrated to the city from rural areas that the conflict between the state and the guerrilla movements had rendered uninhabitable. The displacement of Colombian civilians by that conflict, a conflict that had been running in various forms since the 1960s, had produced, by the 1990s, one of the largest internally displaced populations in the world. People arrived in Bogotá with nothing, in districts that offered nothing, and found themselves in the particular poverty of the urban informal economy, selling food from carts, cleaning houses, providing sexual services, or finding other ways to extract small amounts of money from the city's more prosperous residents. Burundanga offered one more way. It was not a good way, but it was a way that worked reliably enough to have become, across a generation of criminal practice, effectively standardized. The preparation of Burundanga, the extraction of the alkaloid from the plant material into a form concentrated enough to be useful and stable enough to be stored and transported, became, over the course of the 1980s and 1990s, a cottage industry in the regions where the borrachero grew. The powder that resulted was white and fine, visually indistinguishable from cocaine, in small quantities. It had no significant taste. It had no significant odor. It dissolved completely in any liquid, coffee, beer, aguardiente, water, without changing the drink's appearance or flavor in any way that an unsuspecting person would detect. And it could, at concentrations that required only a small quantity of powder, produce in a healthy adult human being the state that the CIA's researchers had spent years and classified budgets attempting to reliably induce: conscious, ambulatory, cooperative, amnesiac. The criminal application was straightforward enough that it required no sophisticated organization to implement. A woman at a bar, a conversation, a moment of distraction, a few grams of powder dissolved in a drink left briefly unattended. What followed? The victim's willing compliance, their active participation in their own robbery, their subsequent inability to provide any coherent account of what had occurred, required no further action from the perpetrator beyond basic social engineering. The vice journalist Ryan Duffy, who traveled to Bogotá to investigate Burundanga for a documentary produced in 2012, interviewed a woman named Jessica Maria, a sex worker who used scopolamine as a professional tool. She described its use with a directness that Duffy found, by his own account, deeply unsettling. The men she targeted would help her take their possessions. They would open their own wallets. They would provide their ATM codes. They would, in some cases, accompany her to their bank and stand calmly at the counter while she directed the transaction. When asked, they spoke normally. When guided, they cooperated completely. When the drug wore off, typically somewhere between 12 and 24 hours after administration, They remembered nothing of any of it. Jessica Maria's account of the drug's function had the quality of a technical briefing. "We use it to rob men," she told Duffy. "Men use it to rape us. Everything about scopolamine has to do with hurting people." The statement was not offered as a confession or a lament. It was offered as a description of an environment, the simple and brutal ecology of a drug that existed in her world as both weapon and vulnerability, deployed by those with the presence of mind to use it and suffered by those who did not know to be afraid of it. Duffy had arrived in Bogotá intending, as he later wrote, to try the drug himself under controlled conditions. A journalistic experiment of the kind that requires considerable confidence in one's own judgment about what constitutes a controlled condition. He left without doing so. The stories he had gathered in the city changed his mind. He described the experience of simply learning about the drug as sufficient to produce a lasting wariness about accepting drinks from strangers. The Bogotá chief of police, interviewed for the same documentary, offered a sociological account of the drug's use that was notably different from the sensationalized version circulating in international media. The most common scenario, he explained, was not the elaborate criminal conspiracy, but the mundane transaction. A sex worker, often from an impoverished background, targeting a man who appeared to have money. The drug made the robbery easier and safer than physical confrontation. It left no marks on the victim. It produced no noise. It generated no immediate police response. The victim would not call the police until the following day, if they called at all, and by that point, the perpetrator was gone, and the victim's account was, from a forensic perspective, essentially useless. The cases that were documented in sufficient detail to illustrate the pattern had a quality of the surreal that no amount of prior knowledge fully prepared a reader to encounter. A businessman recalled, from fragments of the morning after, that he had apparently spent several hours helping 3 strangers move furniture from his own apartment into a vehicle parked outside. His neighbors confirmed that he had seemed fine, helpful, even pleasant, holding doors and directing the process with every appearance of voluntary participation. His television, his laptop, the small amount of cash he kept at home, and a box of documents he had never thought to protect because he had never imagined anyone would want them, were gone. The businessman had no memory of the strangers' faces. He had no memory of the conversation that had presumably preceded the packing. He had no memory of holding his own front door open while his own possessions were carried through it. What he had, when he woke the following morning, was a sense of profound wrongness before he had identified any specific thing that was wrong. A feeling, as he described it, of having been absent from himself. The scale of the phenomenon was documented by the United States Overseas Security Advisory Council, which had been monitoring scopolamine-related crime in Colombia since at least 2012. Their estimates, eventually incorporated into the State Department's official crime and safety reports on Bogotá, put the annual number of scopolamine incidents in Colombia at approximately 50,000. The figure was described as unofficial. The counting methodology was imprecise, the underreporting was substantial, and the relationship between reported and actual incidents was impossible to establish with confidence. But the order of magnitude was considered reliable. Tens of thousands of incidents per year in a single country involving a substance that left its victims with nothing they could usefully tell an investigator. 70% of documented victims in Bogotá had been robbed. 3% had been sexually assaulted. The remainder had experienced other crimes: fraud, extortion, coerced involvement in additional criminal acts that the drug's compliance-inducing properties had facilitated. The numbers represented only the cases that had been reported and confirmed. They said nothing about the cases in which the victim never connected their experience to a drug, or never reported it at all, or reported it to a police force that lacked the capacity or the inclination to record it in a manner that would appear in official statistics. The delivery mechanisms had evolved alongside the drug's criminal use. The most straightforward method, dissolution in a drink, was widely known and widely warned against, and warnings about it had become a standard feature of travel advisories for Colombia. So the methods adapted. Powder blown directly into a face, a technique associated in popular accounts with folded papers, with maps consulted at close range, with business cards handled by someone who had coated them with the substance. Powder applied to paper currency, to packages, to surfaces that the target would handle without thinking. In some accounts, powder dissolved in a cream or lotion that could be applied to a handshake. The methods ranged from the pharmacologically plausible to the possibly apocryphal. Some, when subjected to scientific scrutiny, appeared to require quantities of the drug that would be difficult to administer in the manner described, while others were entirely consistent with the drug's known absorption characteristics. What was not apocryphal was the pattern of incidents reported by hospitals, by police departments, and by the families of victims across 2 decades of documented use. The city paper Bogotá, which covered the phenomenon with consistent attention across this period, recorded case after case that followed the same fundamental shape: a social encounter, often in a bar or club or on the street, an interval of time that the victim could not account for, a discovery, typically the following morning, that their money, their phone, their valuables, sometimes their apartment's entire contents, were gone. And a police officer across a desk, listening to a person try to explain something that had happened to them and that they could not remember. The particular cruelty of the drug, from the perspective of those trying to prosecute its use, was that it produced victims who were unreliable witnesses to their own victimization. They had been present, they had participated, in a technical sense, in everything that had been done to them. They had been conscious and articulate and cooperative throughout. They simply had no memory of any of it. Not because their memory had been attacked or damaged, but because it had never been engaged. The filing system had been switched off. The events had passed through them like light through glass, leaving no record of their passage. A Colombian psychiatrist who spoke to the journalist Wired described the drug's effect on victims as making them disoriented and sedated enough to be easily managed, while leaving their surface behavior intact. This description, clinically accurate as far as it went, nonetheless failed to capture what the experience appeared to be from the inside, which was, by every account, that victims managed to piece together from fragments of sensation and the testimony of witnesses something closer to a gap. Not an experience of being controlled, not a memory of compliance. Simply an absence, a period of hours that existed in the historical record, in bank statements, in security camera footage, in the accounts of neighbors and strangers, but nowhere in the mind of the person who had lived through it. The gap was the crime, and the gap left nothing to prosecute. The legal system's response to this prosecutorial impossibility was, across the years of the drug's widespread use, largely inadequate. not through indifference, but through the structural mismatch between what the law required and what the drug produced. A successful prosecution for robbery required, in most formulations, evidence that the victim had not consented to the transfer of their property. A victim of Burundanga had, in every observable sense, consented. They had been present. They had participated actively. The cooperation was not feigned. The compliance was genuine in every way that a court could measure. Which was precisely the problem, and precisely the feature that made the drug so extraordinarily useful to those who employed it. Proving that the consent was chemically induced required toxicological evidence, and toxicological evidence required a test conducted within a narrow window of time after exposure. Most victims did not present to hospitals or police stations within that window. They presented the following morning, when the drug had metabolized and the standard tests returned negative. The crime had occurred. The evidence of the crime had been metabolized, and the victim sat across from an investigator, trying to explain an absence in themselves that the law had no established vocabulary to describe or prosecute. By the late 1990s and into the first decade of the new century, Burundanga had become a fixture of Colombian criminal culture in a way that distinguished it from other drugs of abuse. It was not recreational. Nobody, as far as any documented account established, took scopolamine for pleasure. The effects at criminal doses were not pleasurable. They were, for the person experiencing them, a form of extended absence from their own life. The drug had one use, or rather, as the sex worker Jessica Maria had put it with concise accuracy, 3 uses: to rob, to study, or to kill. The studying referred to pharmaceutical research, which continued to use scopolamine as a standard tool for inducing controlled amnesia in research subjects. The robbing and the killing required no further explanation. The CIA had spent years and classified budgets pursuing the concept that Burundanga made routine on the streets of Bogotá for the price of a few pesos. The government of the most powerful nation on earth had found the threshold between useful compliance and dangerous delirium too unpredictable to be operationally useful. The streets of Bogotá had found the threshold close enough, and so the drug that governments had failed to weaponize became, in the informal economy of a city that formal institutions had partially abandoned, something considerably more dangerous than a classified program. It became ordinary. It became, in the fullest and most disturbing sense of that word, routine. There is a particular quality to the accounts that victims of scopolamine give, once they have been told what happened to them and have had time to examine whatever fragments of sensation they can locate from the hours of their exposure. The accounts are not accounts of suffering. They are not accounts of fear or pain or the adrenaline-saturated clarity that characterizes the memory of most traumatic events. They are accounts of absence, of a gap in the self that the person circles around from the outside, describing its edges rather than its interior, because the interior, in any experiential sense, does not exist. One man, interviewed by Colombian journalists several weeks after his own experience, described the period of his intoxication as feeling, in retrospect, like a room he had been in but had not entered. He knew from the evidence of what followed, the empty bank account, the testimony of the taxi driver who had driven him to 3 different ATM machines in the space of 2 hours, the security footage that showed him conducting each transaction with perfect composure, that he had been present in that room. He could not access the room. It was there in his personal history, the way a period in childhood is there before the formation of reliable memory. A time he could reconstruct from external sources, but not from within. Another victim, a young woman who had been drugged in a bar in the Chapinero district of Bogotá, described one fragment of sensation that had survived. Not a memory exactly, but something she characterized as a texture. A sense of warmth, of ease, of the particular comfort that comes from having nothing to worry about. She had not been frightened. She had not been in distress. She had been, as far as she could tell, from this single surviving fragment of the experience, entirely contented. It was the contented quality of the experience that she found afterward most disturbing. The drug had not only removed her capacity to resist, it had removed the part of her that would have wanted to. A third account, gathered by researchers at a Bogotá university conducting a study into the psychological aftermath of scopolamine victimization, came from a man who had been a senior accountant at a firm in the financial district. He was, by any measure, a careful and methodical person. Someone whose professional life was built around the precise tracking of things, around the discipline of knowing where every figure went and why. He described the experience of reconstructing the lost hours from external evidence as the most disorienting experience of his professional and personal life. More disorienting, he said, than any of the specific losses, because the losses he could have eventually accepted. What he could not accept was the evidence that he had been, for a period of approximately 16 hours, a different person. Not a person in distress, not a person under duress, a person who had made decisions. Coherent, goal-directed decisions, decisions that required a certain practical competence to carry out, that bore no relationship whatsoever to his values, his interests, his judgment, or his will. The decisions had been made by his body while he was not home, and when he returned, the consequences were waiting for him, and the decisions that had produced them were nowhere he could find or examine or understand. This is the pharmacological detail that separates scopolamine from the instruments of conventional coercion, and that makes the accounts of its victims so difficult to process through the ordinary frameworks we use for understanding harm. When a person is robbed at gunpoint, they experience fear. They remember the fear. The memory of the fear is itself evidence. Evidence of violation, evidence of the breach between what was wanted and what occurred. Evidence that can be presented in a courtroom and understood by a jury as proof that something was done to someone against their will. The fear is the proof that the will was present and was overridden. Scopolamine removes the fear along with the will. The victim is not afraid because the evaluative function that would generate fear, the function that assesses the situation as dangerous, that calculates the threat to one's interests, that produces the physiological cascade of alarm, has been suspended along with everything else the drug suspends. The body moves through events that would normally produce terror with the equanimity of a person doing something entirely unremarkable. The bank teller sees a customer making a withdrawal. The taxi driver sees a passenger who knows where he wants to go. The neighbors see a man who appears to be helping people move furniture and who seems content to be doing so. The equanimity is not performed. It is not a mask over distress. It is the genuine affective state of a person whose threat detection system has been chemically switched off and whose remaining consciousness is operating in a kind of pleasant vacancy, present, responsive, cooperative, and entirely empty of the self-interest that would, in ordinary circumstances, make cooperation with one's own robbery impossible. What remains after the drug wears off is not post-traumatic stress in the conventional sense. Some victims reported, particularly those who learn the details of what they did during their intoxication, and find those details more disturbing than any experience of direct distress could have been. The businessman who helped carry his own television out of his own apartment, the woman who accompanied a stranger to her own bank and stood at the counter, providing her account details and waiting calmly for the transaction to complete. The knowledge of what one's body did while one was not present in it produces a particular and poorly mapped form of psychological distress. Not the distress of having been harmed exactly, but the distress of having been absent from the harm, of having participated in one's own violation without any of the resistance that would make the violation comprehensible as violence. Psychologists who have worked with scopolamine victims in Colombian clinical settings have noted that the standard frameworks for treating trauma are imperfectly suited to the experience. The usual therapeutic premise, that the traumatic event produced a response that the patient is now processing, that the memory of the event is the site of the wound, does not apply when the event produced no response and left no memory. What remains is something closer to an intellectual wound than a psychological one, the knowledge of the gap rather than the experience of what the gap contained. The neuroscience of what occurred during the gap is, by contrast, precisely understood. The hippocampus, as we have established, was not recording. The muscarinic receptors were blocked. The signal that would have converted experience into memory was never sent. But what was the experience in neurological terms while this was happening? What was occurring in the brain of the person who was withdrawing money from an ATM, or packing their own belongings, or opening their door for strangers, while their hippocampus remained silent? The answer, as far as neuroscience can currently reconstruct it, is that the brain was functioning. The motor cortex was directing movement. The language centers were producing speech. The visual cortex was processing the environment. The person was, in all the ways that can be observed from the outside, present and operational. What was not functioning was the encoding mechanism. And separately, the prefrontal cortex's contribution to executive decision-making, which scopolamine disrupts through pathways that are still not entirely mapped, but whose effects are consistent enough to be reliably observed. The prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain most closely associated with what psychologists call executive function, planning, judgment, the evaluation of consequences, the capacity to refuse a request by weighing it against one's own interests and finding it contrary to them. Its disruption under scopolamine is not total. The person can still speak, still respond to questions, still perform tasks requiring relatively complex coordination. What they appear unable to do is generate, from within, the resistance to a request that does not come with an external instruction to resist. They can follow instructions. They appear unable to contradict them. This is why the drug works so effectively in the context it has found. A criminal who instructs a victim to go to an ATM is providing an external instruction that the victim, in their scopolamine state, will follow. The victim's prefrontal cortex is not generating the counter-instruction. Do not do this. This is not in your interest. This person means you harm. Because the prefrontal cortex is not generating much of anything from within. It is responding but not initiating. It is a receiver in this pharmacological state, rather than a transmitter. The philosophical weight of this, of an experience that removes the will without removing the person, that leaves the body operational while evacuating the self, is not something that clinical language handles comfortably. We have frameworks for understanding coercion. The person was threatened. The person was overpowered. The person complied because the cost of non-compliance was made unacceptable. We have frameworks for understanding incapacitation. The person was unconscious. The person was incapable of action. The person was not present in any meaningful sense. What we do not have comfortable frameworks for is the state that scopolamine produces, in which the person is present, is capable, is cooperative, and is in every observable dimension acting freely, while the mechanism that would make those actions free in any morally meaningful sense has been chemically suspended. The will is not overcome. The will is not present. And the person in whose body the actions occur is, afterward, left to incorporate into their self-understanding the knowledge that their body is capable of acting thoroughly against their interests, thoroughly against their values, and thoroughly without their knowledge, while presenting to everyone who encounters it every appearance of being entirely themselves. Research into scopolamine's effects on suggestibility, as distinct from its effects on memory, has produced findings that complicate the simple picture of a compliance drug. The drug does not, clinical studies suggest, make people universally and unconditionally compliant. It does not transform a person into a puppet who will do anything they are told without hesitation. What it does is remove the internal resistance that would normally make a person evaluate a request before complying with it. In ordinary circumstances, a request, "Go to the ATM, give me your code, open the door," is assessed before it is acted upon. The assessment takes a fraction of a second and occurs below the level of conscious deliberation in most cases. But it occurs. The prefrontal cortex weighs the request against the person's interests, the context, the identity of the requester, the plausibility of the framing. Only requests that pass this assessment, that seem reasonable, that come from trusted sources, that fit within the person's model of what is appropriate to do, receive the authorization to proceed. Under scopolamine, the assessment step is dramatically attenuated. The request arrives. The resistance does not generate. The action follows. The person is not performing a calculation that comes out differently than it would sober. They are not performing a calculation at all. The criminal who frames their requests as reasonable, who presents the ATM visit as a helpful errand, who frames the door opening as a normal domestic act, is providing the cognitive structure that the drug has removed. They are, in effect, supplying the person's executive function for them, and the person, operating without their own, accepts the supplied version without friction. The result, from the outside, is indistinguishable from willing cooperation, and from the inside, to the extent that there is an inside, to the extent that the scopolamine state has an interior at all, it appears to be characterized not by distress, but by that quality of warmth and ease and uncomplicated contentment that the young woman in Chapinero had described. Not the experience of someone who has been robbed, the experience of someone who is, for reasons they couldn't examine and would not remember, simply willing. The dose that produces this state is not a large one by the standards of what scopolamine can do. The maximum approved medical dose for legitimate therapeutic use, the amount in a motion sickness patch, released slowly over 72 hours, is 0.33 milligrams. The doses associated with criminal use in Colombia are estimated, based on clinical presentations at hospitals, to be substantially higher than this therapeutic ceiling, but not necessarily dramatic in absolute terms. What is dramatic is the margin between the dose that produces compliance and the dose that produces coma, and beyond that, death. A dose of 10 milligrams, still a small physical quantity, a few grains of the fine white powder, is sufficient to induce coma in a healthy adult. At higher doses still, scopolamine produces respiratory failure. The person stops breathing. The margin between the dose that makes someone cooperative and the dose that kills them is not a comfortable one, and it is not a margin that criminal users manage with pharmaceutical precision. They are working with powder of variable concentration, administered through routes of variable absorption efficiency, to subjects of variable weight and health and individual sensitivity. The cases recorded in Colombian hospitals include a significant proportion in which the victim did not merely lose memory and will, but lost consciousness entirely, arriving at emergency departments in states ranging from deep sedation to respiratory distress. Some did not arrive at hospital at all. The State Department's figure of 50,000 annual incidents was an estimate of the cases that entered the reporting system in some form. It said nothing about the cases that ended before the victim could report anything. The overdoses that were attributed to other causes, the deaths that were recorded as cardiac events, or alcohol poisoning in people who had, in fact, been given far more scopolamine than their bodies could tolerate. The drug that left the CIA's classified rooms too imprecise for government purposes was, on the streets of Bogotá, precisely imprecise enough to occasionally kill the people it was used against, and common enough that the killing, when it occurred, was not treated as remarkable. It was a hazard of the method, absorbed into the city's statistical background the way all such hazards are absorbed, as a cost so diffuse and so distributed that it never quite accumulated into the kind of visible emergency that might have compelled a different response. The molecule remained, patient, colourless, waiting for the next bar, the next drink, the next stranger with a folded piece of paper and a practiced socialese and a few grams of white powder that the city had learned over a generation of daily use to fear, and had not yet learned, despite that fear, to adequately stop. For most of its documented history, scopolamine crime was understood as a Colombian problem, a serious one, a persistent one that the country's authorities had struggled to contain, and that international travel advisories had dutifully noted for decades. But a problem with a geography. It belonged to Bogotá, to Medellín, to the particular social and economic conditions of a country that had spent 2 generations absorbing the consequences of the drug trade. Travelers were warned about it the way they were warned about altitude sickness in the Andes or petty theft in any major city. Real, worth knowing, manageable, with sufficient awareness and caution. That understanding began to change around 2015. In Paris, in the spring of that year, 3 individuals were arrested and charged in connection with a series of incidents in which tourists had been robbed after being exposed to an anticholinergic substance. The cases shared the by now recognizable signature. Victims who had encountered strangers in public spaces, near the Eiffel Tower, outside major museums, on the banks of the Seine, and who had, in the hours that followed, lost money, phones, passports, and any memory of how they had lost them. The French authorities did not initially confirm scopolamine as the specific agent involved, and the European Monitoring Center for Drugs and Drug Addiction expressed public skepticism about whether the Colombian-style Burundanga attack had genuinely migrated to Western Europe, or whether the cases reflected a different substance or a different method. But the toxicological picture that emerged from the hospitalized victims was consistent with anticholinergic poisoning, and the operational pattern was identical to what Colombian police had been documenting for 2 decades. The arrests in Paris were followed by similar reports from other European cities: Brussels, Barcelona, London. The reports were difficult to confirm and harder to quantify. Victims who presented to hospitals were not always tested for scopolamine within the narrow toxicological window that would produce a definitive positive result. Victims who did not present to hospitals at all, who woke the following morning confused and depleted, and decided, as many do, that they would rather not undergo the secondary ordeal of a police report, were invisible to any count. But the pattern of accounts was coherent enough and consistent enough across cities that had no prior history of the drug's use, that investigators began to take seriously the possibility that burundanga had followed its users across borders. The vector, as it emerged through the reporting of the following years, was not the drug trade in the conventional sense. The people bringing scopolamine to European cities were not cartel distributors or organized criminal networks with established supply chains. They were, in many cases, Colombian nationals, some of them the same population of economically marginalized women who had used the drug in Bogotá, who had traveled to European cities and discovered that the method worked there too. The targets were wealthier. The environments were less familiar with the risk. The victims were, if anything, less prepared to be suspicious of a friendly approach from a stranger offering directions or asking for help reading a map. The method required no logistical infrastructure beyond the powder itself, which was compact, undetectable by airport security in quantities sufficient for multiple uses, and easily obtained before departure. The city that attracted the most sustained international attention, however, was not in Europe. It was Medellin. Medellin in the 2000s had undergone one of the most remarkable urban transformations in modern Latin American history. The city that had been, in the early 1990s, the murder capital of the world, the operational base of the Medellin cartel, a city in which the daily homicide rate had been so high that ordinary civic life required a constant renegotiation with violence, had, through a combination of government investment, urban planning innovation, and the institutional changes that followed the cartel's dismantling, become something that international media had taken to calling a model of urban renaissance. Cable cars connected the hillside comunas to the city center. New libraries and public spaces had been built in the neighborhoods that violence had most devastated. The murder rate had fallen by more than 90% from its peak. Tourists arrived, first in the dozens, then in the hundreds, then in numbers that reshaped entire neighborhoods. El Poblado, the district in the south of the city that had always been its wealthiest, became a destination for international visitors in search of the combination of warm weather, low prices relative to their home currencies, and the particular frisson of a city that had survived something extraordinary. Short-term rental platforms filled the district's apartment buildings with travelers. Restaurants and bars proliferated. The infrastructure of tourism, hostels, tour operators, English language, menus, currency exchange counters, established itself with the speed that follows genuine demand. And into this infrastructure, with the pragmatic adaptability that has always characterized its use, scopolamine followed. What made El Poblado's tourists specifically vulnerable was not naivety. Many were experienced travelers who had read the standard advisories. What made them vulnerable was the social environment that tourism itself had created. The neighborhood had become, by the early 2020s, a place where meeting strangers was the point. Its bars and rooftop terraces were filled with people who had come specifically for the experience of encounter, to meet other travelers, to meet locals, to be in conversation with people they had not previously known. The social openness that tourism produces, the willingness to talk to strangers, the mood of curiosity and exploration was not a flaw in these visitors. It was the entire premise of their being there. The criminal use of scopolamine in El Poblado exploited not their ignorance, but their reasonable expectation of a welcoming environment. The incidents in El Poblado followed a pattern that differed from the classic Bogotá street robbery in one significant respect. The initial contact was increasingly digital. Dating applications, Tinder, Bumble, Grindr, and the Colombian app Badoo became, through the late 2000s and into the early 2020s, documented vectors for scopolamine encounters. The operational logic was straightforward. A digital introduction removed the awkwardness of a cold approach, established a degree of apparent trust before any physical meeting occurred, and allowed the criminal to select targets with greater specificity. A profile suggested wealth, nationality, the degree of local knowledge the target possessed. A conversation revealed how long they had been in the city and how familiar they were with its risks. The meeting that followed, at a bar, at an apartment, over a drink, proceeded as meetings from dating applications do, with one addition that the target did not know to anticipate. In January 2024, the United States Embassy in Bogotá issued a formal security alert warning American citizens about a pattern of incidents specifically associated with dating applications. The alert noted that at least 8 suspicious deaths in Colombia had been linked to what it described as drug-facilitated crimes, and that several of the victims had made initial contact with their attackers through dating platforms. The alert recommended that travelers meet people from applications only in well-populated public spaces, that they never accept drinks they had not personally observed being prepared, and that they be aware that the risk was not confined to nightclubs or bars, but extended to private residences where the absence of witnesses made the already limited prospects of subsequent prosecution essentially nil. This created a systematic blind spot. A victim presenting with confusion and memory gaps would typically be screened for alcohol and benzodiazepines. Scopolamine would not appear on a standard panel. It would appear only if someone thought to look for it. And someone would only think to look for it if they were already aware it was a possibility. The confirmed cases were the cases where a physician happened to recognize the symptom pattern and requested the specific test in time. The true prevalence of scopolamine crime in European cities in the years following 2015 remains genuinely unknown. What is known is that confirmed cases existed in enough cities to establish that the problem was real. The alert did not use the word scopolamine. The embassy's legal review team had apparently concluded that naming the specific substance would raise questions about sourcing and confidence levels that the advisory's format could not adequately address. But the description of the symptom pattern, victims who could not account for extended periods of time, who had apparently cooperated actively in the transfer of their own property, who presented at hospitals or police stations the following day with no memory of the relevant events, was, to anyone who had followed the Colombian crime literature, immediately recognizable. La Reina de la Scopolamina, the Queen of Scopolamine, was the name that Colombian media gave to a 27-year-old woman arrested in El Poblado in 2023, identified by authorities as the leader of an Ibex all-female criminal gang that had been operating in the neighborhood for at least 2 years. The gang's method was the dating application approach, refined to a degree of operational sophistication that the arresting officers found notable. Targets were selected, cultivated over multiple digital interactions, and met in locations that the gang had pre-selected for their combination of privacy and accessibility. The gang's members maintained multiple profiles across different platforms, rotating them to avoid pattern recognition. They maintained records on a phone seized at the time of arrest, of which targets had been approached, which had been successfully drugged, what had been taken, and which had reported the incident to police, and therefore should not be contacted again. The records were, in their cold organizational thoroughness, a document of industrial-scale predation. The gang had not been operating opportunistically. They had been operating systematically with the planning and the record-keeping of a small business. The Queen of Scopolamine was not a desperate woman making difficult choices in poverty's shadow. She was, by the evidence of the phone's contents, a criminal entrepreneur who had identified a market, developed a method, built a team, and managed the operation with a degree of professionalism that the investigators who processed her case found difficult to entirely separate from a certain grudging admiration for its execution. The phone records from La Reina de la Scopolamina's arrest told a story that was, in some respects, more disturbing than any individual account of a drugging. The gang had been operating, by the evidence of the records, for at least 27 months before the arrest. In that time, they had documented what investigators estimated to be several hundred successful operations. The word the records used was trabajos, meaning simply jobs. Each entry noted the date, the platform on which contact had been made, the nationality of the target, the location of the meeting, and an assessment field that the gang used to note whether the target had reported the incident to police. Those who had were flagged. Those who had not, the large majority, were noted as clear, a designation that carried, in its bureaucratic neutrality, the full weight of the drug's fundamental advantage. The victim who remembers nothing cannot report what they do not remember, and a crime that cannot be reported produces a perpetrator who remains, in every official sense, at liberty to work again tomorrow. The phone also contained photographs, images of the identification documents of victims, their bank cards, the keys to properties that had been entered after the victims had been returned, still docile, to locations where they would eventually wake alone. The photographs were evidence. They were also, in their accumulation, a record of scale that prosecutors found both valuable and deeply sobering. This had not been improvised. This had been a business. And the business, until the arrest, had been running without serious interruption for more than 2 years. She was not an anomaly. She was an example of how far the drug's criminal use had evolved from the improvised street-level robberies of the 1980s, from the woman at the bar with a pinch of powder, into something more organized, more scalable, and considerably more difficult to detect or prosecute. The 2023 statistics for Bogotá, published by the city's Crime Analysis Unit, recorded 1,409 confirmed scopolamine incidents, a figure representing a 16% increase over the prior year. The confirmed incidents were, as all such figures for this drug, are, a significant undercount of the actual number. The reporting rate for scopolamine crimes was estimated by researchers at the National University of Colombia to be somewhere between 15 and 30% of actual incidents, meaning that the true number of Bogotá scopolamine crimes in 2023 was likely somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 in a single city, in a single year. The drug that had begun as a tool of colonial-era coercion, that had been isolated in a German laboratory in 1880, that had been administered in a Dallas jail in 1922 by a physician who believed it would change the world, that had spent a classified decade in CIA safehouses, that had emerged onto the streets of Bogotá in the chaos of the cartel era. That drug was now everywhere its victims were. It was in European capitals. It was in the restaurants and apartments of a Colombian city that had been nominated as a model of urban renewal. It was in the phones of young women who had turned it into a scalable business. It was in the dating applications that millions of people around the world use every day to meet strangers, in the reasonable belief that a digital introduction provides some meaningful protection against the particular kind of harm that requires no weapon and leaves no mark. The molecule had followed the money. It had followed the tourists. It had followed the infrastructure of modern connection, the apps, the platforms, the frictionless digital introductions that bring strangers into physical proximity with an ease that the drug's users had understood, earlier than most, as an opportunity. And the night, for the people the drug found in that proximity, still went blank. There is a question underneath all of this that the clinical accounts and the crime statistics and the Senate hearings and the dating app warnings do not quite reach. A question that the man in the Bogotá police station, sitting across from an officer with an empty bank account and no memory of the night before, was living inside without being able to articulate it. A question that Robert House, in his Dallas examining room in 1922, was circling without knowing it. A question that Sidney Gottlieb, in the classified rooms of MKUltra, was pursuing in the only language available to him, the language of chemistry and control and national security, without ever finding the words for what, at its deepest level, he was actually asking. The question is this: what is the will exactly? What is the thing that scopolamine removes? We use the word freely, as if its referent were obvious. Free will, the will to resist, the will to refuse. We speak of it as something solid, a faculty, a capacity, a feature of the self that is simply there, like eyesight or the ability to walk. We assume, without examining the assumption, that the will is the most fundamental thing about us, that it is the mechanism through which we are ourselves, through which we are authors of our own actions, rather than objects acted upon by forces external to us. Scopolamine, with the particular kind of instruction that only chemistry can deliver, teaches something different. It teaches that the will is a process, a chemical process running in a physical substrate, dependent on the continued availability of specific neurotransmitters and the uninterrupted function of specific receptors in specific regions of a 3-pound organ that sits, unprotected, behind the thin shell of the skull. It teaches that the self, the evaluating, deciding, refusing, remembering self that each of us experiences as the most fundamental and irreducible fact of our existence, is not a separate thing from the brain that houses it. It is the brain's activity, and brain activity, like all biological processes, can be interrupted. This is not a comfortable lesson, The Enlightenment built its entire political and moral architecture on the premise of the rational agent, the individual who, by virtue of their capacity for reason and choice, was entitled to the protections of the law and the dignity of a person rather than the dispensability of an object. The social contract, the criminal justice system, the concept of consent, all of it rests on the assumption that persons are, in the relevant sense, self-determining, that when they act, they are the authors of their actions, that what they do reflects, at some meaningful level, what they chose. A world in which a pinch of white powder dissolved in a drink can suspend self-determination in a healthy adult for 24 hours is a world in which that architecture sits on less stable ground than we typically allow ourselves to notice. The Enlightenment's political philosophy was built on a foundation that its architects did not think to examine, because the foundation appeared too obvious to require examination. The person, the rational, self-determining individual, was treated as a given. The philosophers debated the extent of natural rights, the basis of legitimate government, the boundaries of individual freedom, and the conditions under which a society might justly constrain the choices of its members. What they did not debate was whether the self that made choices was reliable, whether the faculty of reason that they placed at the center of their moral universe was robust, whether the thing they were building their entire civilization around, the autonomous, willing, deciding person, was as durable as they needed it to be. Scopolamine is a small, chemically precise answer to a question the Enlightenment did not ask. It says, the person you are building around is fragile. The faculty you are treating as foundational can be interrupted. The will you are enshrining in legal and moral architecture is a biological process, and biological processes have failure modes. The answer is not to abandon the architecture. The protections it has built are real and valuable and hard-won. The answer is to hold it with the awareness that it rests on something more vulnerable than its designers understood, and to extend to that vulnerability the care it deserves. The CIA understood this imperfectly and incompletely, from the wrong direction, understanding the vulnerability of the will as something to be exploited rather than something to be protected. The cartels understood it practically and without philosophical elaboration. The will could be removed, and its removal was useful. The streets of Bogotá understood it statistically. 50,000 times a year, in a single country, the removal occurred. And each time it did, a person woke the following morning and attempted to reconstruct, from the testimony of strangers and the evidence of empty bank accounts and the contents of security camera footage, who they had been while they were not present in themselves. Memory, the neuroscientists tell us, is not a recording. It is a reconstruction, a process of active reassembly that occurs each time we remember something, drawing on traces stored across multiple regions of the brain, filling gaps with inference and assumption, shaped by what we know now as much as by what we experienced then. What we call memory is more like a story we tell ourselves, revised with each telling, than a fixed record of events. The hippocampus is not a camera. It is, at best, a first draft. The philosopher Derek Parfit spent much of his career examining what he called the relationship between personal identity and psychological continuity. The question of what makes you the same person across time. The question of what binds the self of this morning to the self of last week and the self of 20 years ago. His answer, developed across hundreds of pages of careful argument, was essentially memory. overlapping chains of memory, connecting experience to experience, creating the continuous narrative thread that we experience as a self. We are, in this account, not things but processes, patterns of psychological continuity maintained by the ongoing work of remembering. Scopolamine cuts the thread. It does not destroy the self. The pattern continues on either side of the gap. The memories before and after the drug remain intact. The person wakes into their own continuity, as if stepping from one room to another and finding the corridor between them simply gone. But the gap is there, a period of their autobiography that they cannot access, that they cannot integrate, that they must know about rather than remember. And the knowing, as every victim account suggests, is a fundamentally different kind of thing than the remembering. It is the difference between reading a chapter of your own life story and having lived it. Scopolamine removes the first draft entirely. It does not corrupt the reconstruction. It prevents the reconstruction from having any material to work with. There is no trace because there was no encoding. The story cannot be told because the events, in every neurological sense, never entered the system. The person wakes to an absence where a night should be and must build their understanding of what happened to them entirely from the outside, from what others tell them, from what the evidence shows, from the logic of consequence. Consider what this means for the man at the police station. He has lost money. He has lost property. He has lost a night of his life. But what he has lost most completely, the thing that no insurance claim and no police report can address, is his continuity, the thread that connects who he was before the drug to who he was during it, has been cut. He cannot access the hours. He cannot integrate them. He knows, in the way one knows something that the mind refuses to fully absorb, that his body moved through the world for an entire day, and that the person who moved through the world was not, in any sense, he can locate or recognize him. This is what the drug does at its deepest level. Not robbery, not assault, not even the violation of will exactly, because to violate the will must be present. What scopolamine does is more precise and in its way more disturbing. It creates a period of action without an actor, a stretch of autobiography with no author, a night that happened to a body that no one was home inside. And yet, the man at the police station is alive. He is sitting in a chair. He is speaking to an officer. He woke up that morning, returned to himself from whatever the drug had made of him, and found that the world was still there and that he was still in it. He lost money. He lost property. He has a story now, an incomplete, fragmentary, externally sourced story that he will carry forward and that will change how he moves through the world. He kept his life, and his life, with its memories intact from everything before the drug and everything after it, is the thing that makes the loss of a single night recoverable. Not easy, not unmarked, but recoverable, because the self that the drug suspended was not destroyed by the suspension. It returned. It is sitting in that chair. The man at the police station has something that the CIA's classified program never achieved, and that the cartels and the gangs with their dating app profiles were never trying to give him, a complete accounting of what was done to him. Not a memory. The memory is gone and will not return, but an accounting, the bank records, the security footage, the neighbor's testimony, the taxi driver's log. From these external sources, he can construct a narrative of the night. Not his narrative because the night has no narrator who was present, but a narrative. a version of events that is true, that is verifiable, that gives him something to carry. And this is not nothing. This is, in fact, the thing that distinguishes his situation from the CIA's unwitting subjects, many of whom were never told what had been done to them, and who carried their confusion and distress into lives that provided no framework for understanding why they felt as they did. They had no accounting. The record was destroyed. The gap in their experience was accompanied by a gap in the available truth, and the two gaps together produced a form of harm that was different in kind from what the drug alone created. A harm compounded by institutional denial, by the deliberate erasure of the explanation that would have allowed them to understand themselves. The man at the police station has the explanation. He knows the name of the drug. He knows the mechanism. He knows that what happened to him was not madness, not moral failure, not the consequence of some flaw in his own judgment that he must carry forward as a reason for shame. He knows that a chemical process was interrupted, that the interruption was done to him, that it was not him. The borrachero tree is still growing. In the mountain cloud forests of Colombia, in the Andean valleys, where it has grown for longer than any written record, it continues to produce its white bell-shaped flowers and its fine-grained alkaloids with the complete indifference of a plant that has no interest in what its chemistry means to the creatures it affects. It is not malevolent, it is not aware. It is simply a tree doing what trees do, generating the compounds that its evolution has determined it requires, utterly indifferent to the centuries of human history that those compounds have generated. The meaning of the tree, the use of the molecule, belongs entirely to the people who have encountered it. The shaman and the Spanish colonist and the obstetrician in Dallas and the CIA biochemist in Virginia and the woman at the bar in Bogotá and the gang with the dating app, profiles, and the phone full of trabajos. All of them found in the same white powder the thing they were looking for. The molecule did not choose its uses. We chose them. We always do. What we do with that knowledge, the knowledge that the will is chemical, that the self is fragile, that consciousness and agency are not the same thing and can be separated by a few grains of something that dissolves without taste or odor in any liquid, is, in the end, the only question that is ours to answer. The practical answer is the one that the U.S. Embassy offered in January 2024, and that every travel advisory about Colombia has offered for decades, and that the Bogotá police chief offered to Ryan Duffy in 2012. Be careful. Do not accept drinks you have not watched being prepared. Meet people from dating applications in public spaces. Be aware that the risk is real and that it does not discriminate by nationality or gender or education or sophistication. Be aware that the victim is not the person who accepted a drink from a stranger. The victim is the person whose drink was altered without their knowledge. The distinction matters. It matters enormously. But the deeper answer, the one that this history, traced from a mountain forest in the Andes through the interrogation rooms of the Cold War to the phones and bars and streets of the contemporary world, seems to arrive at, is something quieter. It is the answer that comes from understanding rather than merely knowing that the self is a process maintained by the brain's ongoing activity, and that the brain's ongoing activity is the most remarkable and the most fragile thing in the known universe. Be present in it. Be grateful for it. Protect it with the attention it deserves. The night is quiet now. The hours ahead belong to you, recorded, encoded. yours to keep. The hippocampus is doing its work. The chemistry is running. The first drafts are being written. Sleep is not the same as scopolamine. Sleep is the brain's own restoration, the process by which the day's experience is consolidated, the memories deepened, the self renewed for what comes next. You are not absent in sleep. You are, in every way that neuroscience can measure, more present, more actively engaged in the work of the being yourself than you are in the blank and borrowed hours that this drug creates. So let the night do its work. Rest now. The history is told. The flower is far away, and the night around you is your own. Good night.